The President, please be seated. The court is now back in session. We would like to now hand over to the co-prosecutor to continue putting questions to the witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Mr. Rockoff. When we broke for lunch, you were describing the moment that you moved to the French embassy, and during which time you saw many Khmer Rouge troops marching into the city on one side of the road and residents of Phnom Penh walking out of the city on the other side. Did people who were being forced to leave Phnom Penh include the elderly and sick?
Yes. As for the 17th of April, early evening, the lines of civilians headed north, it was families to include elderly. And as for the sick or infirm being kicked out of the hospitals, such as Calmet, I did not see that until the second day, looking out from the French embassy. You would see, in one case, a patient being pushed on a gurney, people on crutches, but the Calmet hospital was being emptied.
And you were able to observe the emptying of the Calmet hospital from the premises of the French embassy?
Only to where we could see people headed north past the French embassy. We could not see the Calmet itself from where we were at the embassy.
Mr. Rockoff, the defense in this case has claimed that the evacuation of Phnom Penh was in part a humanitarian mission necessary because of food shortages in Phnom Penh. My question for you is, did you see Khmer Rouge forces making any effort to provide food, water, medicine, or other humanitarian assistance to evacuees who were leaving the city?
I did not see any assistance provided by the Khmer Rouge. As for assisting people with food, there was some provided to people in the French embassy. Vegetables, we were given 1 pig a day, which was butchered and had to feed quite a few people. But that was just what the Khmer Rouge allowed us to have. I have no idea what was going on regarding provisioning of food.
I want to return now to something you mentioned this morning. We had talked about the Red Cross having medical operations at the Hotel Phnom. Did the Khmer Rouge allow the Red Cross to continue its activities, including its medical operating room at Hotel Phnom?
No, the Red Cross had to evacuate along with everybody else. And the group of people I was with, to include Sidney Schonberg, John Swain, Dith Prawn, we were following some Red Cross people. There was a small vehicle that they were pushing. A lot of people pushed instead of driving because the Khmer Rouge would stop you from driving. But pushing a vehicle was okay, as crazy as it may sound. So there was a small vehicle with Red Cross and a lot of their provisions that arrived at the embassy the same time I did.
Were you present at the hotel when the Red Cross was ordered to leave, or did you simply witness them moving out of the hotel ahead of you?
I did not witness the Red Cross being ordered out. The time interval at after leaving the Ministry of Information, stopping at the hotel to pick up a few things, we were there only 15 minutes maybe. The evacuation was in full force from the hotel at that point. So I did not see the Red Cross being ordered out, but they were leaving the same time we were.
I want to turn now to a few questions from the period that you were at the French embassy. And can you start by telling us the time period after you arrived at the French embassy on the evening of the 17th of April? How long did you remain at the embassy?
Crossed into Thailand, Thai border, I believe the 9th. 2.5 days to get there from the French embassy. So it was from the 17th till, I'm not certain which date the convoy left, maybe the 6th. I'm hazy on that.
When you say the 6th, you're talking about May. It was sometime in early May that you left the embassy.
Yes, 6th May. So that would be from 17 April to the day we crossed into Thailand, I believe, 9 May.
And during the time period that you stayed at the French embassy, were you aware of whether Khmer Rouge military forces were stationed outside the embassy?
Yes, we could see them walking by. They were always in 2s or 3s. On occasion, the Khmer Rouge cadre would come into the embassy, and the French consular officials insisted on accompanying any Khmer Rouge that came in. On one occasion, they came in searching for film. Also, Many Khmer were forced out of the embassy after the first or second day. One time, two very young Khmer Rouge came into the embassy. They got into a little trouble with their cadre because they came up and they were asking for cigarettes in sign language, not asking verbally. And were just curious about us, and then a French consular official came by, saw them, and kicked them out. One time I went outside the embassy through a hole in the back wall, went out with a Japanese photographer, Naoki Mabuchi. There was a small hole in the wall that was covered by straw matting. Some of the servants would come and go from the embassy without having to go through the front gate. So I went through the hole in the wall to the lake, Bangkok, the lake that used to be there, and I was washing up. There was a rain barrel. I was with Naoki Mabuchi, who spoke very, very good Khmer. He was translating. I saw that there were armed Khmer Rouge ringing the side of the lake I was at. About every 50 meters to 100 meters were a couple of armed Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge that we were talking to at the hut that had the rain barrel, they wanted cigarettes, and they were just smiling. They weren't aggressive. And I went back to the embassy to get my camera and go back out, and I got into a little trouble because they found out I left the embassy.
And I take it from your comment that that was the last time that you left the embassy compound through that hole?
Yes.
Mr. President, I'd like to play now a second video clip for the witness. This is a clip from the film titled Khmer Rouge History of Genocide. It is document D10A/32.2R, item 994 in the list of audio-visual materials in Xylab. It has been given E3 number E3-23489 and is also identified as V00172506. The clip I'd like to play is from 27 minutes and 10 seconds through 27 minutes and 59 seconds from the original film. It's the second clip that was provided to the audio-video booth. Request that the audio-video booth play that clip at this moment. Thank you, Mr. President.
The President, you may proceed. AV booth unit is now instructed to put up the video on the screen.
My first question, Mr. Rockoff, do you recognize the location and events that were depicted in that video?
Yes, those scenes are inside the French embassy.
And was this film taken during the period after 17 April when you were taking refuge at the embassy?
I can't say if it was after the 17th or the 16th or 17th, I'm sorry. But almost everybody in that video I had seen at the embassy. But I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly what day.
Did you recognize any of the people who were in the video? Can you tell us which people you recognized?
I can't remember names, but I do recall some of the people visual, some of the press, and there were a few of the local foreign community.
While you were at the embassy, did you see someone who had a camera who was taking video footage?
Well, a number of people were taking still photos or film, no video back then. And a lot of the footage shot inside the embassy, which may or may not include some of this, was probably shot by Christoph Marie Frode, Austrian cameraman, who I touched on earlier, having shot the scene near Sartamai on 17 April, the Khmer Rouge soldier with the .45 pistol. I have to assume he shot a lot of footage. He was very busy in the embassy.
Thank you. The next area I'd like to ask you about is, and you touched upon this a little bit, while you were present at the embassy, were you aware of discussions or negotiations that were taking place between representatives of the Khmer Rouge and representatives from the embassy?
It was relayed to us by certain journalists that there were talks going on and that the Khmer Rouge had permitted the French embassy to have radio contact with the outside regarding this issue. But beyond that, I knew nothing else.
I'd like to read to you now another excerpt from John Swain's journal. This is his entry for 6 p.m. on the 18th of April, 1975, and it is document E3/51 at English S00003280, Khmer S00644717, and French 00 597840. And the excerpt in Mr. Swain's journal describes a meeting that had been called by Paul Ignatieff, the head of UNICEF in Phnom Penh, for all the internationals, quote, including the 22 journalists in the compound, 15 members of the Red Cross, including the Scottish medical team, 6 United Nations officials, and a handful of other nationalities, including Americans, during which this meeting it was reported on progress that had been made, quote, during 2 meetings with the Khmer Rouge authorities, who called themselves the Comité de la Ville, or the City Committee. My first question to you is, do you remember being informed of a city committee or a Comité de la Ville that was the authority who spoke on behalf of the Khmer Rouge at meetings with embassy representatives?
No, I was not aware of that term, and the meetings were not done in the area that most of the foreigners and the press stayed. It was in another area. I mean, I was kept in the dark about a lot of this.
Were you aware that there were a number of Lon Nol officials who had sought asylum and were located in the embassy?
Yes, such as Sisawa Sarikmatak, yes. I was not there when he had to leave the embassy. I was in another area. But we were aware there were a number of Lon Nol people in there, but majority of those were just ordinary soldiers, such as the scene you showed on the video a short while ago, the soldier that was being operated on by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and he died. He was shot in the neck, but they tried to save him, and he passed away. But there were a few other soldiers there. There was a group of minorities that came over from the other side of the Mekong. There were about 300 at least in their group. They were forced out of the embassy at gunpoint. Was there for that. They were military, those 300.
I'll return to that group of people in a few minutes. I'd like to read to you now a telegram that was sent by the French consul, Jean Dirac, on the 18th of April in 1975, whose subject was political asylum. This is document D199/26.2.199. To repeat, D199/26.2.199. And in this telegram sent to his superiors in Paris, Mr. Dirac reported, quote, following ultimatum from City Committee, I am compelled, in order to ensure the security of our compatriots, to include in the list of persons present at the embassy 1. Prince Sirik Matak and 2 of his officers, 2. Princess Mom Manavong of Lao origin, 3rd wife of Prince Sihanouk, her daughter, her son-in-law, and her grandchildren, 3. Mr. Ung Bun Hor, President of the National Assembly, and 4. Mr. Lung Nal, Minister of Health. Barring express and immediate order from the department requesting me to grant political asylum, I will be compelled to turn these names in within 24 hours. End of quote. You've made mention of Sirik Matak being at the embassy. Does this refresh your recollection of other significant persons associated with the Lon Nol regime who were also seeking asylum at the embassy?
I had no knowledge of these other officials at the embassy. I heard about Sisawa Sirik Matak maybe 2 days later as to the significance of what had happened. There was a lot of confusion the first 2 or 3 days, not certain who was in there, how many. It was a few days before the majority of the Khmer who did not have documentation were forced out. I'm sorry I couldn't give you an estimate, but there was a large group of military also that had nothing to do with the ordinary civilians who fled there.
Are you able to tell us, before people were required to leave the embassy after a few days, before that time, as of the 18th of April, approximately how many people were taking refuge or shelter at the French embassy?
I'm sorry, I could not hazard a guess. Sorry.
I want to turn now to the events that took place on Sunday, the 20th of April, 1975. You've already made mention of this, but I'd like you to recount for us as best you can the day on which Cambodian nationals who were at the embassy were required to leave. Can you tell us in your words what you remember from that day.
Well, it was kind of dark. It was cloudy, and there were a lot of cheerful goodbyes between the Khmer who were leaving and those who were not. I'm sorry, I'm trying to recollect. It's very difficult. There were a few friends of mine in that group that went too, and it wasn't until years later I've heard reports about what happened to some of these people. Of the Cambodians who left the embassy and survived, there's only one I know of personally that would have been Dith Pron.
And were you able to observe when these people left the embassy, were they required to evacuate from the city as other people had been required in the previous days?
Everyone headed north. The group of military and their families, I wasn't sure for a long time, for years, what happened to them. I know that after they left, most of the people had passed out of sight, that there was a fair amount of gunfire from the sports complex just north of the French embassy. Some people thought, oh, they're just shooting at the clouds to drive the rain away because it was raining. It was very gloomy weather. But I'm told a few years later there were reports that people were shot in the sports complex. Who exactly, I don't know. But that was told to me that that's the origin of the gunfire we heard.
And when was it that Prince Sirikh Matak left the French embassy? And what did you hear of the circumstances of his departure?
At the time, I heard nothing immediately. It was discussed a few days later. And I'll tell you, some of the print journalists don't share their observations or information with certain other people, to include photographers. So I hate to say it, I was in the dark about a lot of things until I left Cambodia.
Fair enough. You mentioned another group of soldiers, a large group, and I want to ask you, the group that you're talking about, were they a group referred to as Fulro, people who were Montagnard ethnic minorities?
Yes, some of them were. And some had fought in Vietnam and were in a lot of trouble in Vietnam, such as one Major Capado, who was with Vietnamese elements in Vietnam when the Montagnard revolt occurred, and because he had, along with a few of his comrades, shoved a bunch of Vietnamese special forces into a bathroom, a latrine, and then chucked grenades in on him. He was under death sentence in absentia in Vietnam from the Saigon regime, so he fled to Cambodia and fit in perfectly with the other minorities living on the east side of the Mekong. And because his unit's outpost was besieged by the Khmer Rouge for some weeks, and then Major Capado, came to Phnom Penh. He saw me because I had been out with his unit before. He recognized me. He told me about his compound, which was maybe 20 miles roughly from Phnom Penh, how the Khmer Rouge had encircled it so they couldn't go out anywheres, but there were hundreds and hundreds of Khmer Rouge just passing by, just moving on towards Phnom Penh. So he managed to get his wife and a couple of other people out. They escaped. He was covered with thousands of scratches and bug bites, from the escape. Made it to the Hotel Royale where he saw me. He was shocked that the Americans had evacuated on 12 April. He took his people to the French embassy.
And these Montagnard ethnic minority soldiers, whose side had they fought on in either the Vietnam or the Civil War in Cambodia?
They fought on the American side. They fought with the Vietnamese, but there were problems between the Vietnamese and the Montagnards, which culminated in the so-called Montagnard Revolt. But they were fighting in their own district and worked very close with the Americans, not the Vietnamese, the Americans. And also the group in the French embassy was not that heavily Fulro. There were quite a few in the group, but I would say they're a minority in that group. The rest were pure Khmer. And through marriage, because Capado had a Rade wife and there were other relatives here in Cambodia, he was Khmer. Even though he was considered Montagnard by the Vietnamese, he had a strong affinity with the Khmer Kampuchea Krum.
Could you explain to the court what Fulro was?
Well, I won't use my poor French, which is not existent. It's Federation for the Liberation of Oppressed Minorities. I believe that's what the French acronym translates to.
And you mentioned a few minutes ago that you witnessed the time when this group of ethnic minority were required to leave the embassy. Can you tell us what you saw, what your observations were on that day?
Well, Pado and his wife, other people were getting all their gold and their jewelry together, took it off, put it in a bag. The Cambodian soldier that was being operated on by the Red Cross had died. They were going to bury him. It took me easily a kilo to 2 kilos of gold and some gems all in a bag. They put it under his body. Before they did that, between the gold and the body, they put a grenade. They wrapped tape around it, pulled the pin, and just left it like a booby trap, and then buried him. And then later on, these people had to leave. But the idea was hide the gold, don't let the Khmer Rouge get it. And they were very calm, despite the fact they were probably sure they were going to their doom. There was no. They were very calm, very quiet. I couldn't believe it.
The last subject that I would like to ask you a few questions about is your trip out of Phnom Penh and out of the country. Can you tell us how it was that you left the French embassy and traveled out of Cambodia?
Well, the foreigners were split into 2 groups. There was the first convoy that left, and the trucks came back a few days later to pick up the rest of Chinese trucks. There were 24 people per truck, 2 bench seats, 6 people sitting on each seat, and the other 12 standing up in the center. And what bags, whatever you have in the center, you could sit on. The driver and a Khmer Rouge, and there was a French consular official watching us just as intently as the Khmer Rouge were. And the convoy of trucks left, headed south on Manivong, turned right to the airport. At the airport, there was a huge red banner flying. The truck went past the airport some kilometers and then made a right turn and headed north. We went off paved roads onto trails, pretty well-traveled trails. The convoy paralleled government road fairly well, but off the main roads, such as going up Highway 5. Normally you would go with Udong on the left. Well, this time we're traveling with Udong on the right in the middle of nowhere, but making fairly decent time. What slowed us down was each time we got to the edge of a district, the convoy would stop, Khmer Rouge in a jeep would go up ahead, get clearance for us to go through the next sector. So we spent a lot of time waiting, sitting in place. It was a 2.5-day trip to the border.
And when you drove through Phnom Penh on your way out of town, could you describe your observations of the city as you made your way out of town?
Most striking change is absence of people. Very few people. And when you saw people, they were Khmer Rouge, and you did not see families, didn't see civilians. The only group of people I saw were some Khmer Rouge soldiers, looked like they were exercising. It was out by the train station, like calisthenic. On the road to the airport, nothing, except occasional armed Khmer Rouge soldiers in 2s or 3s along the way, or at intersections.
And when you traveled through through Cambodia, did you go through other cities or towns on your trip? And what did you see when you went through? If you did, what did you see when you went through the other cities and towns of Cambodia? We
overnighted at a Wat in Battambang. We arrived at night and left before daybreak, so I had no visual impression of Battambang whatsoever.
And Mr. Rockoff, I have no further questions for you, and I understand my colleague does not have any questions. Mr. President, we were able to obtain some photographs from DC Cam, which we distributed to people. There wasn't any new photographs there that I would use today. I would, as the witness has negatives back in America, and we can make a request to the court after, but we would certainly be interested at the least, if it was possible, to get a hard copy of your photo at the Ministry of Information that you identified in the video. But that's something that we can request later. We have no questions at this time, and I appreciate very much you coming here today and answering our questions.
The President, thank you. Next, we would like to hand over to the lead co-lawyers for the civil party.
Good afternoon again, Mr. President, Your Honours, and all present, and good afternoon to you too, sir. I am international lead co-lawyer for the civil parties, and I have a few questions for you. Regarding the civil parties, my questions are follow-up questions, and I would seek your clarifications on some details, if it's possible, in the aftermath of the questions put to you by the co-prosecutor. You are a photographer, allow me to put some questions to you that are not only related to your profession, but that are important because you spent 2 years in Cambodia and you certainly saw and heard a number of things from a personal standpoint, and you will be in a position to enlighten the chamber on that. My first question has to do with the period prior to the 17th of April 1975. Since you had been there for 2 years, this morning you told the co-prosecutor that it was difficult to get out of Phnom Penh during the period from 1973 to 1974 and early 1975. Apart from Kampong where you went in 1974, where else did you go during that period, sir?
When I say it was difficult to get out of Phnom Penh, you have to realize the major highways were all cut by the Khmer Rouge. The army was always trying to open the highways, especially Highway 4 to get to Kampong Spu. On occasion, I could go there. I'd been to Siem Reap when the government retook a temple complex, not at Angkor, but Rolos Group. And the Ministry of Information flew some of us up on a Khmer Air Force plane, and the plane had to land on the road because the Khmer Rouge always had the airport. Kampong Chenang, where I was wounded one time, and of course I've been wounded a couple of times on Highway 4, twice near Ieng Sary, which now is a part of Phnom Penh, but before the Khmer Rouge took Ieng Sary, held it, the government would take it back, Khmer Rouge would take it. The Khmer Rouge on occasion would get as far as the railroad tracks that you cross to come here every day. So the situation was very fluid. Some days you could go only a little ways. And if you wanted to go to provincial capital, usually you had to get a ride with the Cambodian Air Force. Many of the places I had been to aren't cities. They're just on the road or in the field. I'm sorry, that doesn't give you a more comprehensive list of where I went.
Do I understand correct that you only went to zones that were not occupied by the Khmer Rouge, but by the Lon Nol army?
I don't think the Khmer Rouge would let me go with them in their liberated area.
I would like to hear this from you. While you were traveling to those places, did you see any refugees fleeing from the zones occupied by the Khmer Rouge?
Yes, many times.
Can you tell us something about what those people were saying, what they described when, if at all, you spoke to them during that period? What exactly did they say?
I can't say I had the chance to speak to them, to question them about the situation. A lot of the interviews were done by refugee agencies once the people were directed to a camp. I would hear stories, second, third-hand accounts later on, but I had no direct contact talking to these refugees. The Phnom Penh was like a huge refugee camp. In fact, the Hotel Cambodiana had 23,000 refugees living in it.
For the time being, I am talking about the places you went to. We'll talk about refugees subsequent. I have another type of question. During the period from 1973 to 1975, you were in Phnom Penh with journalists, educated and informed person. What would one hear, or what was said regarding Khmer Rouge policy during that period preceding the fall of Phnom Penh? That is among you, whether we are talking of people who are politicians or not.
Two things that I heard repeatedly in the last month or so of the war was, when the war is over, everybody will go back to where they came from before the war. And since there were 2 million or more refugees here in Phnom Penh who were not from Phnom Penh, that was probably good news to them. And the other thing we heard a lot was those Khmer who put $1 million or more into the fund for the final offensive would have a place in the new Cambodia. That was something that I was told was on their radio broadcast. It was part of the information being sent around. I don't know if anyone was naive enough to believe that, but that's what was going around. But the one thing that a lot of people had no problem with is going back home after the war.
Did they say anything about the lifestyle of the Khmer Rouge and the people living with the Khmer Rouge regarding policy and the implementation of such policy?
No, I can't answer that. I'm sorry.
Thank you. You have spoken somewhat about refugees who arrived in Phnom Penh and who came from the occupied zones. You also said that there were in large number. Can you tell us something about what those people described, what the said regarding the situation in occupied zone, what was happening in those occupied zones. Can you tell us something on that subject?
I wish I could. I'm not the one who interviews these refugees. As I said, I'm sorry I can't answer that.
Let me point out that may not have been said to you. Can you tell us whether your friends and journalists heard things and related them to you? What did they tell you?
Nothing. They would not tell me anything. They're usually trying to find out from me. They're not going to tell me. They're going to ask me.
Thank you. You have spoken about the army and the troops when they arrived in Phnom Penh. You took photographs of those soldiers. And you said a while ago that there were many adolescents who were young and even very young. Before the 17th of April 1975, had you heard anyone talk about the Khmer Rouge Army? Had you heard any comments on how the army was built up and how people were enlisted into that army? Did you hear anything said by your friends or anyone in your entourage?
No.
Prior to the 17th of April in Phnom Penh, did you hear names of persons who may have been senior Khmer Rouge leaders at the time? Did you hear any name mentioned before the 17th of April?
Well, not exactly, although there was one Cambodian who worked in the Ministry of Information, and he kept saying his brother will be here soon. His brother will be in Phnom Penh soon. And this guy's name was Salith Chai. His brother was Salith Sar, also known as Pol Pot. He had no idea the importance of his brother. It's my understanding he is missing himself out on the highways, just like so many others.
And as of the 17th of April, did you hear anyone give the names of any Khmer Rouge leader, people who were supposedly going to be Khmer Rouge leaders? Did you hear any such name?
I heard no names mentioned. I had no knowledge of any individuals or personality.
On the 17th of April, you met some staff members from the Preak Hospital, and they told you something you said this morning. Unless I'm mistaken, they said that the Khmer Rouge were evacuating the hospital. You went there. Had you already taken note of that evacuation when you went there? Were the rooms vacant? Were the beds not occupied, or were they occupied?
Some beds were occupied by the dead, bodies on the floor. You saw a photo earlier of a husband and wife lying dead on the floor, another Khmer sitting on the stairs looking at the body. I have many shots from in that hospital that day prior to walking out and being taken away by the Prekhet Milia Hospital. I knew that hospital from having gone by there before. Also, there was a children's hospital across the street. I had been kicked out of there before, taken pictures by Dr. Beat Rickner. But the Prekhet Milia Hospital, as I said in my testimony earlier when I was leaving Sihanouk Boulevard, Manivong Boulevard, I got a ride with somebody who had worked at the hospital, and he told me it was being evacuated. That is why I went there.
Regarding the evacuation of Phnom Penh, you told the prosecutor that families had to leave Phnom Penh and that those families included elderly persons and children. You also stated that you saw the sick who had to leave Calmet Hospital and pass in front of the embassy. Can you give us a few more details and give us a more precise picture of what you saw regarding that evacuation? What I mean is, did you see many people? Did people leave with personal effects? Were they transported by the Khmer Rouge? Were they on foot or they were on bicycle? Can you give us a few more details and depict exactly what you saw in the days following the 17th of April in Phnom Penh?
Well, the evacuation was not accomplished in one day. It took a couple of days. But the people, the sick and the infirm, the amputees, the patient on the gurney being wheeled down the road, that was the second day, the 18th, I saw that. I had no idea what was going on in the hospital on the 17th. I was on my way past the Calmet to the French embassy. I did not go in there to see what was happening.
How about families you were able to see? Can you tell us a bit more about them?
Yeah, I guess their families, if you see elderly person and a male and a female and a couple of children with them, I have to assume that is the family.
Did people carry any property, and what kind of property? How were they traveling? Were they traveling on foot, i.e. were they trekking or not?
Most were on foot. There were a few vehicles being pushed. The Khmer Rouge will let you pile things into a car, and a lot of people would push the car. Even if it had gas, if you started to drive it, they would stop you. They didn't care about pushing the vehicle. But once you got north of Phnom Penh, you would lose the vehicle and all of the possessions anyway. There were very few bicycles in Phnom Penh among the 2,400,000 that were here. There were not many bicycles. It was mostly what you could carry.
Once you got into the embassy with a number of persons, can you tell us what was being said on the radio, what the Khmer Rouge was saying on the radio? Were they providing information on the evacuation, the new regime, their policies and their practices?
Well, I have no idea what was on the radio. I did have a radio. I could listen to BBC and a few other things. But regarding the Khmer Rouge or other broadcasts, no. And the French embassy, I'm sure, was monitoring it because some journalists that were in close contact with the French diplomatic staff, they were given updates on things. It was up to them to pass on the word to the rest of us journalists. There was a corps of about 5 or 6 journalists that the French coordinated through. Patrice de Beers was one, Sidney Schonberg, John Swain, the A-list of journalists. And so if they had a meeting in another part of the embassy, the rest of us were not part of it. Also, the Khmer Rouge came through the embassy one time because they stated there were illegal radio broadcasts coming out of the embassy. They went through searching for radio transmitters. They let us keep the regular radios that would only receive. And so it's very limited as to what we were able to find out by radio.
Thank you. Were any specific reasons given to you as to why it was necessary for all foreigners to be forced to leave democratic Kampuchea during that period? Was any specific reason given to that effect?
No specific reason was given, although a very strange comment was made by one Khmer Rouge. After a few days, we saw an airplane circling Phnom Penh, 4-engine commercial jet. It turns out that a third country had sold China 2 aircraft, violating what President Nixon wanted to do regarding no sales to China. So it had a big red tail on it. And at the time, Western airline, Northwest Orient Airlines, had a red tail. So some of us saw this plane circling overhead with a big red tail, and we thought, oh, they're going to fly us out. And then we look at it a little closer, there's stars on the red. And it must have landed at Po Chin Tong, and then another flight came in. And one of the Khmer Rouge representatives, along with the French consular official, came to talk to us briefly, discuss food needs, things like that. And one of the journalists asked him, are these planes coming to take us out? The guy tried to reassure us by saying, they're not for you, but you will be leaving. You'll be leaving by road. And one of the journalists asked, why? Why can't we fly? And he said, because we want you to see what we have done. Of course, the reality is they did not show us what they did. But that's what they said as to why we're not being flown out. The purpose of the 2 flights, I, at the time, had no idea. They were probably bringing in the first of the new government, I'm assuming. It just looks so strange. 2 flights of an American aircraft, an American-made Chinese aircraft.
Thank you. And this brings me to my final questions. Mr. Rockoff, you talked about when you left the embassy and was heading towards the Thai embassy, and that the streets were empty, and that you had arrived in Battambang during the night and you had seen nothing during the journey through Cambodia and the countryside of Cambodia. What did you see and what struck you? This was just a few days following the fall of Phnom Penh and the rise to power of the Khmer Rouge.
It was weeks after the rise to power of the Khmer Rouge, 3 weeks later. And on the convoy out, we were not driven past any of the sites of killings, but if the wind is blowing right, you could smell it way off in the distance, smell the body. But they're not going to show us what they... And we didn't go on the main highways, such as Highway 5, where a lot of the atrocities occurred. We went on a road that paralleled some of the road. But the Khmer Rouge had really tight control over what we would see. And when we're in the Wat in Battambang, you couldn't see anything, you couldn't see out. By the time it got daylight, we were outside the city. So I had no idea what was in Battambang.
Thank you. Obviously, I would only want you to share with us what you saw with your own eyes. And on that note, I wish to thank you, sir. I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
The President, thank you, Council. It is now appropriate time for the adjournment. The Chamber will adjourn for 20 minutes. The next session will be resumed by 3 o'clock. Court is adjourned.